Shavua Tov, my friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 3 in the laws of berachot, the laws of blessings. We're going to be learning a very fundamental piece of these laws, and where we're going to be learning what is considered bread, which will ultimately mean that we should say the blessing of hamotzi on that, the special blessing that we say on bread, and make the after blessing, the grace after meals of the 4 blessings that we've discussed yesterday. So the Rambam begins off by telling us that there are 5 species, 5 types of grain, which would, if they are the main component of, as we'll see, then it would be considered bread. And these are wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. Okay? So we have these 5 types. If they are now going to be made bread out of this, if there's going to be flour and water, we take it, we grind it, we make it into flour, and we bake it. That is considered bread. Good old bread. Now, so when a person would eat this, they first would make the blessing of hamotzi, which is the blessing where we bless God, the King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. That's the line in which we say, hamotzi lechem min haaretz in Hebrew. And after that, we would make the grace after meals. We would make the 4 blessings as we spoke. There's the first blessing from Moses, second blessing from Joshua, third blessing from King David and Solomon, the 4th blessing from the sages of the Mishnah, and where we thank God for giving us food and numerous other things. Now, if a person cooks the grains, so let's say a person will take these grains of either barley or wheat and so on, and will cook them, these kernels of grain, then they would actually be considered the blessing of Borei Peri Ha'adama, which is God who creates the fruit from the ground. So it is not considered bread, but rather it is just considered as another dish, the same way you would eat, let's say, spinach, which is cooked, and then you would make the blessing of ha'adama, coming out of the food that comes out of the ground. Similarly, also over here, this kernel of grain, which is cooked, would also have that same blessing. If a person just eats flour, so it's not a grain, but rather it's already been grinded, and now it's just flour, and a person is munching on this flour, then we would just make the blessing of shahakol, which is saying how everything was created by God. So it's not a specific type of food, but rather it's the baseline blessing which applies to everything which is not in those specific categories of fruit that grows from the ground, fruit that grows from the tree, bread, as we mentioned, wine, or a pastry type of food. So now, if a person takes the flour and he now mixes in with water, but he doesn't actually bake it. So now, this would again be counted not as bread. So then you would just make the blessing of mezonot. It would just be counted as a pastry. The blessing of, we say, blessed are you, God, who created various types of food that are sustaining. And then afterwards they would make the blessing of al hamichya, which is a special blessing where we say we thank God. We're actually going to see this at the end of the chapter. The Rambam brings down the entire blessing, but it's a shortened version of the long 4-chaptered blessing. Now, if it's a liquidy substance, so it's flour with water and other ingredients, but it's not cooked and it's just a liquidy, let's say a smoothie, which would, like a shake, which would have flour in it, if that's how someone made that, their shake. So then they would say shahakol. Again, it's just the baseline, how everything was created by God. So now, what about a person that takes flour and he or any one of any one of these 5 grains, as we mentioned, and then they cook this in a pot. And they make like latkes, but made out of flour. Or actually, this would be matzah balls. Matzah balls is matzah. It's the grain. It's the powder. It's the flour of the matzah, which is flour. And now you've added some water and so on, but you've cooked it. So you haven't baked it. It's been cooking in a pot. At that point, it would not be counted as bread, and therefore you would make the blessing of mezonot, which is the blessing that you make on a pastry, on something which is sustaining, but it is not actually bread. So then over here the Rambam is going to introduce a new concept, and he tells us like this: all of the above mentioned will apply in a case where this species, this grain, this flour, was a primary element of this mixture of the food that you were making. Now, if it was only a secondary element, in other words, it is just here to maybe, if you're making, let's say you're frying chicken breast, and you want to make a little topping around it, you want to make it crispy, and you put flour on top. That's one of the ways to do that. And you fry it. In that case, the flour is actually we're just going to make as if it's not here, because it is not the primary part of this food. Primary food is the chicken. And you're just covering it over in order just to add a texture, and therefore you just make the blessing on the chicken, and the flour will just be incorporated within that blessing. And this is a major principle in general in regards to blessings. If you have if you have a food, and there is a primary part of the food, and there is a secondary part of the food, you only make the blessing on the primary food. So if you're eating cereal with milk, so then you make one blessing on the cereal, because the milk is only here to add texture. It's not here as a main component. It's an important component which you want, but since it is not the primary, it is only a secondary, so therefore you would make the blessing only on the cereal, and the milk would just be incorporated within it. But if you finish the cereal and now you're just drinking the milk, well then you should make a blessing on the milk, because now this has become the new primary. So that's a very important concept. So the Rambam gives various examples of this concept. So for instance, he says if you have cabbage, which a person is cooking, and he wants to put some flour to hold it together, the cabbage. So then, again, you would make only the blessing on the cabbage and not on the flour. And so on. Unless, and the Rambam says there's an exception, when you put in, if you are adding a certain substance in order that it should add a primary taste in this food. So for instance, he says if you have flour and you have honey which is covering over this flour, and the honey is here as the primary part, this is what you want to taste, so then you would make the blessing on the honey, because the honey is the primary part over here, because this is the dominant taste. So it's an interesting concept. This would apply in whatever case, whether these two components are mixed together or they are as two separate components. For instance, if a person is eating a very salty fish which is in heavy brine, and then in order to clear that it shouldn't harm their throat or their tongue, they will grab a piece of bread to eat it afterwards. That's okay. You don't actually make a blessing on the bread. You just make a blessing on the fish. And the bread is now incorporated within that. Because the main food which we're eating is the bread, is the fish. How about if a person takes bread, regular bread, now cuts it up and wants to now cook it? So actually, this is what we mentioned earlier. Matzah balls. Used to be bread, used to be a matzah. now you've ground it down. So the Rambam says, so it depends. If this bread still has the shape of bread, and is the size of an olive, in other words, it's big enough that you can actually see that it's the size of bread, so then you would still make the blessing for bread on it, and it would still have everything that the qualifications for bread. But if it is smaller than the size of an olive, or if it has lost the texture, it doesn't look anymore like bread, so then it would just become mezonot. It would just become like another pastry which is being baked. So therefore, if a person takes bread and you make it into croutons, there's the type of food where you take the bread, you chop it up into little pieces, and it becomes a crouton. So if it is smaller than an olive, so then again, it would now just become like mezonot. It would not. You don't have to say hamotzi, the special blessing for bread, and you don't make this special grace after meals, which is specifically for bread, because it has lost its special value of bread. See, in general, we find there's a very important base which we should realize over here. The Torah in Jewish law gives a very special highlight and a special place for bread. Bread is the base, the core of, it's what we eat. It's the basic source of sustenance. And when we eat bread, since it has such a value, so therefore it has a special blessing for itself. So anything which is not bread would then go into their categories. And we're going to be learning this over the next couple of days, the details of how all this plays itself out, but just in general, it's a thing which is important to realize. If a person breaks bread in a weird way, so for instance, there was a way where they would bake bread on the ground. The ground got hot, they would put out the flour and the water, so it's not really baked in the regular way, so then it would also just be mezonot. It would not be counted as bread. It's more like a pancake style. So again, it would be like a pastry. And similarly also, and this is an important thing to realize, if you have flour of one of these species which we've mentioned, one of these 5 types, which has not been baked with water, but rather now it's made with either fruit juice or milk or honey, it's being kneaded with another substance which is not water. So then again, it would not be counted as bread, but rather as another pastry. So they sell what is called mezonot bread. It's not the hamotzi bread. It's not full-on bread, but rather it's a secondary type of bread, which is usually made either with apple juice or orange juice or something like that, which would then in turn make it not as esteemed, so to speak, as bread, but rather it's secondary. Sometimes they'll make, various recipes that we'll call it for that, but that's important to realize. Rice. It's not one of these 5 species. So therefore, a person who cooks rice, the Rambam says the blessing for the rice would be mezonot. The truth is that, I'll just mention over here, in regards to rice, there's actually, there is a discussion in Jewish law, what is the blessing? The Rambam says that the blessing is mezonot, as any other sustaining food. There are other opinions on this. Some say that the blessing is ha'adamah, it grows from the ground. Some say that it's just shahakol. But there are various opinions on this, and ask your local Orthodox rabbi what to do. But the Rambam over here says that the blessing is mezonot. Now, if a person has taken the rice and has ground it down and made it into more like a flour, so again it would also be counted as mezonot once it's being baked. But if it's made out of other types of millets or other types of various plants that grow, even if you've made a bread out of it, it would not actually be considered, it would not even be mezonot. For instance, corn flour is not counted as a pastry. It's just the blessing of shahakol, and because in that case it has lost its value of corn, so it's not the fruit of the ground anymore. It doesn't look like that, but rather it's just the basic, the blessing of that everything was created by God. So, as we said, if a person says hamotzi, the special blessing that we say that God creates bread, so then we would make the 4 blessings after that of the grace after meal. A person who makes the mizonot, the blessing on the pastry, that on the sustaining foods, so then we would make a blessing which is a shortened version of the blessings. And it's called the blessing which is, it includes from the main long version of it. So if a person has eaten a certain amount, in other words, he has eaten more than the size of an olive of bread, so then they would make the grace after meal. If it was less than that, so then they don't have to actually make the blessing afterwards, because they haven't actually been given sustenance from this. It's very little. Similarly, in regards to wine, a person who drinks wine would make the special blessing Borei Peri Hagafen. God creates wine, the fruit of the vine, and then if they drank more than 3 ounces, so then they would make the blessing afterwards. If not, then they don't. And the Rambam says, here is the text of the shortened version that is of the first 3 blessings. So we have, it's called the blessing that includes from the 3 first blessings of the longer version. It's a shorter grace after meal, which is made over not bread, but rather a secondary type of bread, which is more of a pastry, as we've said. So the blessing is that we bless God, creator of the universe, who has given us sustenance and food, and he has given us the land of Israel, which is a beautiful and great land, which he has given us as an inheritance to our forefathers. And we ask from God that he should have mercy upon us, on the Jewish people, and on the city of Jerusalem, and on Israel, which is the place where his honor abodes, and he should bring us there, and he should rebuild it, and we bless God for the food. And then, if it's a Shabbat or holiday, so then we would incorporate an extra line in regards to the specialty of that day. But that is the entire blessing, a very short version of the long grace after meal. That is our class for today. We're starting. It's very fascinating, very practical, very important set of laws over here to know what are the blessings before the food, what are the blessings after food, what food has which blessing. All of that we'll be learning. We've learned today. We're going to be learning that over the next couple of days. So have a very good one in the meantime. We'll see you guys tomorrow, and have a good one.